Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're doing chapter 9 of book 2, which deals with Sparta. We're now finally getting to actual regimes that are well administered. Okay. Aristotle book this whole question of book 2 was, let's go look at the regimes that are held to be nobly or finely cologne administered, rule, the best that are best. Okay, the cities that are best run. Okay, that are no finely or best run. Okay, and but instead we had a theory of not actual regimes. We had first a discussion of intellectual proposals. First of Plato, both of Republic, Socrates' account of the Republic, and then the Plato and his laws, Plato's account of the laws. And Aristotle criticized both of those. Then we looked at Phallius of Calderon, what the father of the communism, who argued that inequality was the real problem of all problems. And then, and the solution is to make everyone equal, and the problem, Aristotle's response to that, and problems. And last was the account of Hippodamus, the first urban planter, first non-political person who was an intellectual or non-act political person who engages in shaping politics. The first urban planner. Okay. Um, Now we turn to a actual city, Sparta. Okay. So concerning the regime of the Spartans and the Cretan regime, and indeed virtually all other regimes, there are two investigations. So therefore, concerning these regimes, in all regimes, not only Spartan and the Cretans, but indeed virtually all other regimes, there are two investigations. One, whether some aspect of the legislation is fine or noble, a coloss, fine, noble, beautiful, or not, with respect to the best arrangement, the taxis. Here's the taxis, the ordering. The arrangement is the structuring of the institutions of laws, the arrangement of the regime. A regime, the politeia. Again, he's not really discussed what the politeia is, and we'll have to go into this. We've read that book 3. He really defines what the politeia is in book 3. He just mentions it here and assumes that this is as he's mentioned earlier, that the politeia and the laws are very connected. That the relationship between what is the law and politeia at first he says laws. We seem to argue that laws are universal and applicational, but he goes, no, no, no. Laws are relative to the regime. He'll make that even more clear later in book 3. But now we've seen the question here. This is, what about the best relationships? What is it? What is it? Is it some aspect of legislation is fine or not in respect to the arrangement of its institutions and structures, which will shape the regime in that sense, right? The other, so therefore, that's the first part, right? There's one, whether is there some aspect of legislation that's fine or not with respect to the arrangement of the institutions and structures of the regime, of the city in that sense. And the other is whether it is if whether it is opposed to the basic premise and the manner of organization of the regime they actually have. Well, in other words, is the regime is there a disconnect between the regime they claim they have versus the regime the institution and organization they actually have, right? Now this is a footnote here, 72. We should look at this. um, um, this is the Greek word. The Greek terms here are hypothesis and topos, right? So therefore, let's go back to here. Um, okay, no, let's do this. Da- um, okay, why is it? There's something wrong here. Okay, I fixed that problem. Sorry about that. That's a little technical issue. So let's go here. So therefore, in other words, whether the second question is whether it's whether it is opposed to the basic present is the regime that they claim, the laws and institutions that they claim they have, is it opposed to the basic premise and manner of organization of the way of life. Now, what is it? Here, the basic premise, as he says, um, the two actual Greek words are again hypothesis and topos, right? So the question, the topos of the regime. In other words, to, to, uh, uh, the basic premise or the the main claim it's doing, the hypothesis of and then um, the actual regime, the topos, the actual topos topic, the character of it, the character. Now it is agreed that any city that is going to be finely Cologne, Colosse, finely, beautifully, nobly governed, must have leisure from the necessary things. But in what manner it should have this is not easy to guess. In other words, the necessity things means the need, the necessary things are the things that you need to survive. In other words, if you just always are struggling to survive, you don't have leisure. Leisure, in fact, the word leisure is skole. In other words, leisure is skole. That's where we get school from, right? Skole. Leisure is this ability that allows you liberation from necessity, right? Is you have freedom. That's what freedom are. Free. That a free person is. If necessity offers you no freedom. If something is necessary, you have no choice. The things of necessity is or doesn't want choice. Choice means that you are free, that you have a choice. You're not. Necessity requires, imposes on you things that you must do. To be free is to have leisure, and that's one. So therefore, in order to have leisure, you have to have things like this. So therefore, it's good that every city should have leisure. That it should have a finely governed must have leisure from the necessary things, necessity. But how they do this? How they do this? How do you get the situation that you can have leisure? Because you still have to have the necessary things must be dealt with. So who's going to do the dirty work? In other words, the rough things of getting the things in order to survive need to be done. So who's going to do it? Okay. Therefore, this is why it's not easy to grasp. For the serfs of Thessaly have often attacked the Thessalians, and similarly with the Spartan helots, uh, who are constantly awaiting their misfortunes as if in an ambush. Now, this is 72. Here the term Spartans, the Toyos Lakos proper, right? Thessaly, Sparta, and Crete are probably a number of other Greek cities had an agricultural serfdom, for which they were different names. The Thessalian name was the Pentinus, was being close to the generic term of serf. These serfs probably consisted of large pre or proto Greek peoples who had been brought into subjection at the time of the Dorian invasions. In the case of Sparta, however, a considerable portion of the Helots were neighboring Messalian of Greek stocks who were conquered in the recent past and remained extremely restive. They sustained a revolt for sustained a revolt for 10 years following the severe earthquake in 464 and were a constant preoccupation of the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War. See Thucydides in these examples. After their decisive defeat at Leucria and a Theban invasion of the Peloponnesian 370, the Spartans were forced to restore the Messalians to independence. So the Spartans weren't, in other words, the other people were serfs. The population, they were pre-Greek, Protos and Dorians came and they conquered them. But the Spartans ruled over fellow Greeks. In other words, there was like other people, the serfs or these people that they're talking about are kind of like people who were there before and who were kind of proto Greeks, and the Dorians came and they imposed upon this. But in the case of the Lacedaemonians or the Spartans, they did what? They imposed on they conquer another fellow Greek population, the Messalians, and they make them to act as their provide their resources for them. It's almost like taking the Herrenfolk, the Spartans saw themselves as Herrenfolk, and that and for the the Messalians were just simply that they were going to do the laboring and things for the better people. Okay, that is what is discussed here. Okay, um, so that therefore this is the problem here. This is the thing. As in the case of the Cretans, however, nothing of this sort has happened. So therefore, this is interesting. Crete doesn't have this enough function. Thessaly and the Spartans, you have the serfs. The Thessalians and other Greek cities have the serfs, but the serfs are pre-Greek. But for the Spartans with their helots, which are the Messalians, they're Greek. Okay, but the Cretians don't have this. However, nothing of this sort has happened. The causes of this is perhaps that the neighboring cities there, even when at war with one another, never ally themselves with those in revolt, since as their possessors of subjects themselves would not be in their advantage. But all the neighbors of the Spartans, the Argives, the Messalians, Arcadians, have been their enemies. In the case of the Thessalians, too, they revolted from the beginning, where they were still there was still war with those in adjacent territories, the Achaeans, the Parabians, and the Magasteans. Now, again, this is the possessors of subjects here. This is 73. Subjects of the Percoloi is a specific terms of this the serfs of Crete. The Cretes have serfs, but they don't have neighboring people in their neighboring are allied to them, whereas the neighborings of those other countries. So Greek, the neighboring people often were in inferior status to them and weren't willing. It wasn't their advantageous to cause problems with them to the Cretan authorities, the serfs of Crete, whereas the other ones were in hostile relationship with the Spartans and the Thessalians, and therefore that's why they encouraged the trouble. If you have, that's the point. If you have these serfs and these uncitizens who are you going to be doing your resources for you, well, for your enemies will use them as a means to cause you problems, and because they might rebel, they might want their independence, they want their freedom, and that therefore again these are slaves. This is the problem. They're serfs, but they're also slaves in that sense. They're like they have this is the problem of serfs and slaves are very much a kind of overlapping concept in the Greek world. We in the Middle Ages we kind of separate them a little bit because serfs are not seen as slaves, but they are. They are servants. They're only servants. They have no rights. They have no political rights, no political status. And whereas and serfs were aliens. Only in fact, they're even aliens. The Spartans. They're not Spartans. They're the aliens. In other words, and slaves are aliens too. So therefore, there is this sense of this, right? Um, now let's continue here. This is the possessors of a subject. These again. This is the footnote here, 47. This is the territories were reduced to subjugation by the Thessalians. The Thessian serfdom is alleged to have originated in mutual agreement. So the original serfdom was mutual agreement. The latter ones were subjugation, right? These are their enemies. Right? In the case of the Thessalians, they too revolted in the beginning when they were still at war with these people. Let's back repeating that line. Now, starting with 4. But it would appear that, apart from anything else, supervisions of them is troublesome in itself. In other words, it's supervising of these people is troublesome themselves, and the manner of one's relationship with them should be It was troublesome. It was what you have inferior people or subordinated people who are going to provide your means to survive, and that but you're not. They're not in your city, protecting your city. They're aliens. They're others who are you're forcing them to provide for you. This is going to be So therefore, it echoes the problems of slavery that we discussed in book one. But here it's even more so because these people have this sense that they and it's going to cause supervision of them is troublesome, and what the manner of one's relationship should of them should be. For if it is lax, they become arrogant and claim to merit equality with those in authority. And yet, if harshly treated, they come to hate and conspire against them. Again, this is echoes the slave, right? If you so everything that's true here about the serf is also true about the slave. And if you're not uh, uh, um, if you're not hard on them, they will become arrogant. They believe that they deserve equality, right? Of those who are ruling them or governing them, or have the word authority here is um, kiros. I believe it's kiros. That means ruling them. Those who are ruling them, those who ruling over them. And that if you're too harsh, they'll they'll resent, they'll conspire, and they will hate. They'll if you're too harsh, they'll come to hate you, right? And they'll conspire against you, right? It is clear then that those who have this it is clear then that those who have this happen to them in connection with helotry have not discovered the manner that is best. So helotry is not, if you're relying on helotry to provide the necessary means so you can be at leisure, this is not the best means. There has to be another means. Therefore, their lackness, furthermore, their lackness concerning women is harmful, both with a view both to the intention of the regime and to the happiness of the city. Now, this is 75. This is an important note. Or deliberative choice. The word is of the poiesis, deliberate choice. This quasi-technical term in Aristotle's moral philosophy. Now, Saunders renders this term chosen aim is apparently used synonymously with basic premise. So the poiesis and the the basic premise use the so the a deliberate choice and a basic premise or hypothesis are kind of synonymously used in Aristotle here. And that therefore this is like he's saying that therefore what's happening here, that the intention of the premise of the regime, in other words, the lackness of women is both harmful to the premise of the regime, the basic principle or hypothesis of the regime, or the premise of the regime, and the happiness of the city. For just as men and women are a part of the household, it is clear that the city should be held to be very nearly divided in two, into a multitude of men and a multitude of women. So, in regimes where what is connected with women is poorly handled, one must consider that legislation is lacking for half the city. So in other words, the city is really two, and if you don't have laws, and if you're not dealing with the women or dealing with them, then you don't have laws for the half the city. That's his point here. So the Spartans are bad about women, he says. That's very much criticism. For this very thing has happened here. This very thing has happened here in Sparta. For the legislator and wish the city to be a whole. In other words, wish the city as a whole to be hardy, and this is manifest in terms of the men. But he thoroughly neglected it in case of the women, who live licentiously in every respect and in luxury. So the men may live Spartan. The word Spartan is nothing. It's to live kind of effectively, efficiently, not that Spartan. Spartan means to be very little, living with very little. The women don't live with very little. They are what they're light. They're Spartan is also to be mild, conservative. The women, Spartan women are licentious and luxury. So it's the opposite of the women and the men are kind of a night and day opposites. He says, and therefore there's two cities there. Really, there's two. The principle of the women is at war with the principle of the men of Sparta. and that's explained by Spartan men, boy loving, um, 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 uh, um, continued. Wealth will necessarily be honored in a regime of this sort, particularly if they are dominated by the women. So women, once you have women ruling, it's going to be wealth is going to matter, status and power is going to matter. So much about feminism being equal. No, because about the importance of power, status, and wealth to provide for the woman. So therefore, this is that wealth will necessarily be honored in a regime of this sort, particularly if they're dominated by women. And as the case with most stocks, they are fond of soldiering and war, excluding the Celts and any others that openly honor sexual relations among male. In other words, this is excluding the Celts and any others that openly honor sexual relations among male. So therefore, they're if this is a weird, interesting comment here. This is a very interesting, nice weird footnote. The Celts were warlike, but what does he mean here? I mean, we think the Celts are warlike, but the Celts and other people who openly honor sexual relations, homosexual relationships, in other words, honor sexual relations among men. Okay, in other words, that homosexuality. That's well. If you openly honor it, see, the Spartans had pederasty, which was teaching. Pederasty was kind of education, but also sex, right? Of boy relationships, right? But these are friendship, weird connection between friendship and eroticism. But it was shameful. You couldn't do it. You couldn't have equal relate. In other words, you could have a sexual relationship with a young boy, but you had with a bearded men having sex. That's shameful in my race. So therefore, there was this therefore this was a very problem for that. Therefore, and because of that, that's why warlike. In other words, those who do this will be warlike unless it's okay to do this, right? It's okay. In other words, there'll be wealth will be doing it, and there will be what that they'll be mostly fond of soldiering and war. Excluding this is against it's the Celts and others who openly honor this. The Celts, however, the question: are the Celts doing this, or is the Celts a different example? I think Celts were. I'm not sure if the Celts engaged in open, had homosexual relationships. I think the Celts were just the exception to this. But I have to know. I'd have to check out more about the pre-Roman Celts. The Romans had taboos about same-sex relationship, more taboos than the Greeks. It was taboo also, but it was usually like this, mostly male. Maybe adult men with adult men, no. Adult men with young boys, that's a different thing. That was kind of like, okay, it's understandable. But then the Greeks also had a big prostitutes issue. Prostitutes, or in other words, in Athens and other Greek cities, prostitutes played a very prominent role in life. Wives were kept in the household. Wives would never leave, go to the markets. Only prostitutes and slaves. If you saw a woman in the marketplace, she was most likely a prostitute or slave. A freeborn woman would never dare disgrace herself by being seen in this marketplace. Therefore, men in public never brought their wives in this time of this type of Greece. It was, and in fact, that's a very interesting book. It's called Courtesans and Fish Sticks, or Fish Sticks and Courtesans, about the life of Athens and like this. And it's a very interesting book in that sense, but I'm not going to just stick with here in this sense. For the one who first told the fable was not unreasonable. In other words, for the one who first told the fable was not unreasonable by pairing Ares and Aphrodite. Okay, in other words, whoever told this about Aphrodite and Mars and Venus, right? Ares and Aphrodite and their love, right? Again, this is 77. This is a tale told by Herodotus, Theogony, but it's uncertain whether the reference is included to be a precise one. Though therefore, whoever told this tale was not unreasonable. All those of this sort are possessed, as it were, when it comes to relations with either men or women, the warlike. In other words, the warlike will be want beautiful women, want powerful. In other words, it is when it comes to relations with either men or women. So therefore, it's ironically gay love. Now, there's something about the warlikeness, about the warrior, something homoerotic. He says it's either that they want it's either something homoerotic or there's something about the glorification of women. Okay, beautiful, wealthy, licentious women, or the or excessive war loving in a sense, right? This is the case with the Spartans, and many matters were administered by the women during the period of their imperial rule, their rule. Now, this is 78. The term arche here means both rule in general and empire. Arche, they're arche, rule. Arche also means starting point, the arche of a principle, right? The beginning fine point of a principle, but also mean rule. That's why the ruler, archon, and then we have, and then this also means empire. Rule is kind of a force of kind of empire or authority over things. Um, and yet, and therefore, the women had over played a very significant role when they had the empire. They ruled over their of other peoples and other things. And yet, what difference is there between women ruling and rulers who are ruled by women? So, what difference is it, women ruling? What difference is there between women ruling? Women are in charge. This is again reference to that famous play, The Assembly of Women, right? The joke, and actually Plato's Republic. There's the women have equality, right? But then there's the famous Aristophanes comedies, The Assembly of Women, the idea that women are going to be in charge, and it's a very dark, ridiculous argument that it's reductio absurdum of the idea that women should rule. In fact, there's a text. Therefore, it makes what difference is there between women and when women rulers are ruled by women? Okay, in other words, these great Spartan heroes are really slaves of their women. Okay, or their homosexual lovers. That's very interesting in that regard to Aristotle. Boldness is something useful in war, if then rather than in everyday matters. So in other words, boldness is that, but rather than everyday matters. But the Spartan women have been very harmful, even in this respect. So therefore, there's that boldness may be useful in war, but then if then, and sometimes boldness in war is not useful. It's conditional, right? But very harmful, even in other words, rather than in everyday matters. If you're too bold in everyday matters, is like this. But the Spartan women have even been harmful, even in this respect. This became clear during the Theban invasion. They were not they were not wholly useless like the women in other cities, but they created more of an uproar than the enemy. In other words, this is a very interesting point. See Hellenica of these events. See Hellenica, Xenophon's Hellenica, and Plutarch's Agellius about how the women basically cause more problems than the Thebans, right? Now, this lackness concerning women appeared to have arisen among the Spartans in a way that is quite reasonable. In other words, there was a problem. The founder, the lawgiver, like Lycurgus, gave laws. He wanted to make it beautiful, but he didn't make the women. He couldn't deal with the women, and he therefore kept quiet. And that's the flaw of it. Like this is Socrates' criticism of Lycurgus in one sense. Um, Arisen among the Spartans that are quite reasonable. They spent as much time away from their own land when they were at war with the Argives, and later with the Arcadians and the Messenians, and thus, once they had leisure, they could place themselves in the hands of the legislature, having been well prepared by the soldiering life, for it involves many of the parts of virtue. In other words, they were warriors. There was, in fact, the whole Spartan way of life. The young boys are sent out to live in the woods and live how to. In other words, the whole Spartan education is designed that the young are kind of taken away at very young, they go live in the wild and learn how to live off the land. They raid and learn these wild creatures attacking basically they're the kind of terror instrument on keeping the helots alive, right? The more you read about the Spartans, the youth in that sense, and then as they get older, they get and then as they get teenage years, they learn they come back in and they start associating with the older men, and they're being trained to be soldiers, and then once they get ready to be young soldiers, and then short on the lines, and then they get sent, and then as they get older, they become only as an older man that you are as a warrior of you're older in your 50s, you go back, you kind of don't, while you're in the service and you're from your middle teens to middle teens to adult until your high 40s, you're in the common messes and you eat together with the men and the boys. Then what happens is, because you're fighting in war and you're always having messes like this with the men, and then what happens is when around your 40s and you're adult, you get married, you pick a wife in your 30s and 40s, but you don't stay with them. You go back to the men at the lectures. It's only when you're older you go back and live with the wife at your house, and your wife usually younger than you, and therefore has really been running things. She's running things. He's saying, right? This is the soldiers, and in other words, as whereas the soldiering life ties to virtue, right? All your life you've been doing, you've been habituated by the soldier life, and the soldier life, and the necessity of restraint, moderation, courage. All of this gives highlights on the virtues, right? As for the women, they say Lycurgus attempted to lead them towards the laws, which were trying to make them virtuous, right? But they were resistant, and he gave up. Right? That's hilarious. In other words, this account appears to place Lycurgan reforms at the end of the first Messenian War in later 8th century. See Plutarch's Lycurgus. Um, the cause of what happened then, and of this era of theirs, and are these. So, in other words, they waited. It was reasonable. They were emphasis too much on war. They were fighting wars. They didn't pay attention. Lycurgus couldn't really force them to change, and yeah. Therefore, just didn't bother. Right, and that's the thing. The causes of what happened then of the errors of these, but we are not investigating whom to exercise to accuse in the matter, but what is correct and incorrect. In other words, this is not a correct manner of doing it, the Spartan way of doing this. That what is connected with the women is not finely colon, not beautifully, finely, nobly handled, would seem not only to create an unseemliness in the regime on its own terms, as was said earlier, but to contribute to their greed. In other words, they're not doing this, and that leads to the greed of the Spartan regime. For after what has been said, what has just been said, one might censor what pertains to the disparity in property. In other words, they're not equal. In other words, they sought to have an equality in the courage, but then what happens is the love of luxury, the women's dominating for luxury and want, this led to desire, the great men trying to please their in other words, their beloved. They aggrandize more and more, and therefore there becomes, even though the men themselves are moderate and like this, but the women lead the regime to be immoderate. And there's a disparity in property. For it has happened that some of them possess much too much property, and others very little. Hence, the land has come into the hands of a few. In other words, again, the regime was supposed to be all equal, but then what happens is, because of women not under the law, and that as he says, what he's saying, that all of a sudden that the women will be a luxury and like this, therefore all of a sudden there'll be inequality, and that some will have a lot of too much, and others will have not enough. And he says this too was poor. This too was poorly. This too was poorly arranged in the laws. For the legislature made the buying or selling of existing property and land something not noble, not beautiful, not good, and correctly so, but he left it open to them to give or to bequeath it as they wish, although the result must be the same in the case that must be the same in this case as in that. In other words, it must be the same in these two. And he says that it does make a difference. In other words, buying and selling is not good, but giving. But the problem was giving gifts, and this ultimately produced the same result of buying and selling. Whereas these two things are more common, similar than, it's not noble to do it, but it's noble to give. But the result ends up being the same. Um, uh, um, uh, um, Indeed, nearly 2/5 of the entire territory belongs to women, both because of many have been given became heiresses, and because large dowries were given. So the women property and women are tied in this sense, and that therefore women have the control of the because of dowries. Some of the women are heiresses from the inheritance of the property, and their dowries are large, and therefore the land that's associated with the wives become and the women become so big, and this creates that one man gets it, and therefore the wealth. In other words, this creates a situation of this situation. It would have been better to have none, or to arrange for a dowry to be small or even moderate. As it is now, not only is there no limit on its size, but everyone is permitted to give an heiress in marriage to whomever he wishes. And if he dies intestate, his heirs can give her to anyone he pleases. Now, the nature of the Spartan system of land tenure and inheritance is controversial. Generally speaking, land is not owned by the citizens, but held under a system of entail based on the original distribution. On what basis is highly uncertain, of allotments. Right? Aristotle seems to suggest that alienization of the allotments was not strictly illegal, but only carried disgrace. So Aristotle's arguing that it was not the alienization or loss of allotment was not illegal, even though we think it is. There is this discrepancy between how the law was preached and how it was practiced. But rather, so what should have been illegal became only merely disgraceful, right? And it is disputed evidence concerning a change in the law affected nearly the 4th century. The overseer Epidus is said to have introduced a bill that would permit a man during his lifetime to give his estate and allotment to anyone he wished, or to leave it so in his will. This is Plutarch at Geas. It is probable that Aristotle here is alluding to this change, which would appear to have been involved merely a liberation of restrictions on persons permitted to receive gifts or inheritance in land. Also, this also involved may have been the disposition of heiresses in the cases where no will existed. Previously, it would seem this had been a prerogative of the kings. See here, in other words, the kings used to have the prerogative. So, therefore, to address the prerogative of the kings, they made a rule that kind of bypassed the kings and their power. So now, that's next here. Accordingly, although the territory is incapable of sustaining 1,500 cavalrymen and 30,000 heavily armed troops, they were reduced to less than 1,000 in number. In other words, because of the territory was not taken. But it became clear through the facts themselves how poor their condition was as a result of this arrangement. The original, for the city could not bear up under a single blow, but was ruined through its own land of manpower. 82. Again, the blow in question is the defeat of Lycurgus in 371. The figures are given by Aristotle appears to apply to Spartan territory prior to the loss of Massalia in 370, and related to the Plutarch's claim in Lycurgus 8 that Lycurgus distributed 30,000 allotments to the Spartan subjects and 9 or 6 perhaps thousands to the citizens. Prior to Lucreta, the Lucretian army, which included a unknown number of subjects serving on a regular basis as heavily armed troops, seems to have amounted to about 6,000 men. Okay, so therefore this is like um, so therefore there's lack of manpower. One of the problems that this wealth and this extremity of things, in other words, this extreme wealth and this extreme situation of dowries and things like this, ultimately led not enough families, and because they like boys a little too much, maybe they didn't have enough children, and therefore there was not enough manpower, and once they were often relying on the serfs that supplement their manpower. And but the problem with that is that once the serfs became free, then they had no manpower. Okay, it is said that at the time of the earliest kings, they gave others a place in the regime, so that no lack of manpower. Then, even though they were at war for a long time, in other words, so they gave people. In other words, they gave. In other words, they took some people and they made them the equivalent of Spartan, Spartaites, they could call them, right? Um, um, and they, in other words, for a long time. Indeed, they were once 10,000 Spartaites. But regardless of whether these things are true or not, it is better for the city to have an abundance of men through the leveling of property. In other words, this is a principle. It is. In other words, once you have a leveling of property, people will have families, and there'll be more children. But if there's not going to be a situation where the property becomes few, and there's going to have many, only the men who have wealth can get married, and the propertyless men won't get married, and they won't have enough. And because of that, few will marry, few will have the wealth, and few will have families, and the many won't. Men won't have families, and you're relying on these foreigners to fight for you. These people who are not your citizens, right? Who are something not going to be part of the regime and part of that, but fight for you. Okay, it's better for the city to have abundance of men through leveling of property. The laws concerning procreation is also an obstacle to correcting this. In other words, for the legislature wishing that there be many Spartites as possible, encourage the citizens to have many children as possible. For there is a law that one who has fathered three sons is exempt from garrison duty, and one with four is exempt from all taxations. Now he's saying, okay, this is 83 here is for or perhaps exempt from normal military service. Afruon, or purion being a Spartan word for a military levy or expedition. In other words, you didn't have to go for your expedition. In other words, this is you were free from like garrison duty means you were free from going to go out and do an exercise. In other words, you were free from being sent on a mission. Because remember, the war was the American citizens were forced to go do things, go fight for the city out there, if there was a required in case of war. So therefore, this you could say, well, I have many kids, I have all these children. Um, and this idea of the Spartites are not just as their children, they're born with non-subjects and like this. They're kind of Spartan, but not really through your wife and your family. Okay. Yet it is evident that if many are born and the land remains divided as is, of them will be poor. Okay. So these people poor won't be able to have their families. There'll be many people, but then for these wealthy citizens, don't. In other words, okay, this is and also and poorly handled, and also poorly handled is the matter of the overseers. Um, this office has been authorized by this has office has authority rule by itself over the greatest matters among them. Yet it is filled entirely from the people, so that very poor men often join the board who, because of their poverty, can be bought. Okay, the overseers here are. Um, this is the Ephroy, the Ephroy. This is the. It seems to be where I believe that that it seems this is 86, right? Um, That's 84. Let's get 84. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. The reading pandize is that the panthos means in other words, it reads with this pantes with the manuscript rather than drexis from the entire people. You can either say here 83 here 84 here from the people versus the entire people, right? So that poor men will be, in other words, filled from the entire people. So that very poor men often join the board because of their property. So the FOI, these overseers of the FOI, they and it can be easily because they're poor. They can be easily bought. They can be easily. This is the problem with poor people. They can be bribed. They can be corrupted. And this is why why Democrats who tend to be poor working class people became very wealthy. Nancy Pelosi's father and Nancy Pelosi millionaires. Why should they be? They came from nothing. Right? They had no real wealth, no things. How they get wealth by corruption, by getting inside deals and things like this. Half the American Democrats are I mean, the only honest Democrat I ever knew would be what was his name is our friend Truman. Truman did not make money for himself. In fact, he had, end of his presidency, he didn't sell anything. He refused to do it. There's something, this is what that thing is. That the days of Truman's are gone. You show me a Democratic congressperson who came in with nothing, and they get their money how by getting insiding preferences and things like this. And same thing with Republicans. Poor Republicans, they have to, if they don't become corrupt, they have to quit. Like, why did Dennis Nunes quit his congressy? Why did Trey Gowdy give up his? Even Sarah Palin give up their political things. Well, they weren't rich enough to afford to be able to keep it. They knew it's too expensive to be a politician, and they didn't want to become corrupt. So what they do, they become a media person and media things and get money, become rich. They use politics to make an opportunity to become rich rather than stay in politics to become rich. Okay, so that's the difference between Democrat and Republican in that sense, honest and dishonest. This office has okay. Let's go. Let's continue here. 20. They have often made this clear, both in the past and now in the Andros matter, where some of them having been corrupted by silver did all what was in them to ruin the city as a whole. Now, this is 85. This deals with, he says, the reference is uncertain. It's probably concerns Spartan intrigues with Persia just prior to the victory of Alexander at Issus in 333. The Persian fleet being active in the Aegean by this time appears to have put in at Argos and have been met there by certain Spartan overseers. King Aegeus is supposed to have met the Persians at the island of Sepros and entered negotiations concerning a subsidy and military aid against the Macedonians, right? So that this idea that they were, because they were corrupt, they could even work against the interest of their own city, okay? And because of the office the office is overly great, like tyrannies. In other words, the overseers are, the uproar are like tyrannical, in fact, because they're too powerful. Even the kings were compelled to try to become popular with them. This has done added harm to the regime, for from an aristocracy it became a democracy. In other words, this aristocracy here, the old aristocratic classes. Now, what happened was that because of the power of the FOI, even the powerful had to learn to live their favor. And because what happened, the FOI became, because of all these poor people, these poor Spartites are out there, they use their position to get into the council, and they then use their thing to get rich, to get wealthy, or to get powerful, and the way they get powerful by selling their power, their power was very powerful to the point that even kings had, and the aristocratic and the other powerful people, the kings even had to kind of submit to them. So an aristocracy became a democracy. And indeed, in the case that this board holds the regime together, in other words, this the F4s hold the regime together. Um, if the people keep quiet because they share in the greatest office, so whether it was through the legislature or by chance that this came about, it's advantageous for their affairs. Now, 86 here is that he's saying he seems to have been widely believed that the Board of Overseers, therefore, were not part of the original Lycaean regime. Aristotle himself later at in book 5, 11, book 5, chapter 11, uh, 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 paragraph 2 and 3, ascribes to its institution to a certain Spartan king, Theopompus, as Plutarch does in Lycurgus. Others' explanations are, none are mutually exclusive, are that the overseers evolved from a college of priests or a council of headmen of 5 Spartan tribes. The facts of the matter remains uncertain. In other words, was this a corruption? Was this a change? Was it evolution? But he says that this is a bad thing from the point of view of the regime, because it led to, and it was advantageous to their affairs, the people's affairs. It led to the changing of the power of the ephoi, the overseers, because they were tied by the people. They were the people's like tribunes in that sense. Again, this echoes the problem in Rome of the tribunes. The power of the tribunes led to the a kind of the abuse of the tribune led to the abuse of the destruction of the Roman regime in that sense. And if a regime is going to be preserved, all the parts of the city must wish it to exist and continue on the same basis. Now the kings are in this condition because of the honor accorded them. The gentlemen on account of the Senate, for this office is the prize of virtue, right? The Senate. But the people on account of the overseers who are selected from all. So therefore, this is the division of that the king is based on honor. The king has the power of honor because of this is expected from them. The gentlemen, they get the Senate, and they're appointed because of their virtue. However, the people get the overseers. When the overseers have them, because who are selected from all, right? This office should have been elected from. This office should have been elected from all, to be sure, but not the way it is now, which is overly childish. Now, this is interesting. 87. For this is our information on the mode of selection of the overseers, and its meaning is uncertain. It has been assumed that the overseers were elected by a vote of popular assembly in the same manner as the senators. In a later remark at 4:9, I see note 89, right? In book 4, chapter 9, section 9. However, in a later remark, Aristotle seems to imply that this was not the case. It has been suggested on the basis of the laws that their selection somehow involves the taking of auspices. In other words, you have to take match and go to the divine into the auspice here. Sorry, This is like this. So this idea that you're going to do lottery, something is not done right. It's childish, like auspices, like lots. We're going to have lots. That, trusting on the gods to make a thing. Auspices, like flipping coins. Okay. Further, though they are of the average sort, they have authority in the most important judicial decisions. Again, this is book 3, chapter 1. He says about this, right? Hence, it would be better if they judged not at discretion, but in accordance with written rules and laws. So therefore, in other words, they rule without law. They make this. They act. They have all the judicials, and they're left to their own decisions without the law guiding them. Okay. So therefore, what they are the average sort. They're not ruled by law. In book 3, this is a naughty thing. If you're going to have the average sort, the people, the average, normal, the many doing it, they should be governed by law. When the many aren't governed by law, they're governed by what they want. This becomes tyrannical. This becomes despotic in character. Also, the comportment of the overseer does not agree with the inclination of the city. It is overly lax. In other words, that because the overseers are popular democratic, they fight against the tightness of the cities, the Spartanness of. They echo with the women. They tend to lead to luxury and abuse, right? Of not they gratify the desires, not restrain the desires, right? Therefore, they do not agree with the inclination of the city. It is overly lax, though in other respects the city goes to the excess and direction of harshness. Right, the city itself, Spartan, this idea of Spartan, it goes to harshness, with the result that they cannot endure it, but sickly run away from the law and seek gratification of bodily pleasures. So the law is too excessive. It's excessive to. It's too harsh, and because they can't endure it, they ignore the law and they embrace bodily pleasures. Okay, this is the paradox of the Spartans in this sense. The matter of the office of the Senate is also not finely or close, beautifully or nobly handled by them. Now, if this were respectable, if this now if these were respectable persons, adequately educated with a view to the qualities of a good man, an andros, right? One would probably say it would be advantageous to the city. In other words, if the senators were really educated good men, the kalos agathos, right? Though doubts could be raised about their having authority in important judicial matters through their lifetimes, since old age affects the mind as well as the body. In other words, you shouldn't have old men making judicial decisions like this, all their whole life. This is why they should be forced to, the American Supreme Court. All those old judges making no. That's why you have old judges with senile minds making laws. No. This is the danger of the thing, he says. Aristotle says this is Aristotle's critique of the American judicial review and judicial power. Okay, I'm more interesting. Book 2 has two implicit critiques of judicial power here. One in the failures of Caldon. No, to Neoptolemus too. The reference to Phileas of Caldon of Hippodamus, and also I think it's Hippodamus as well, and also now in Sparta, right? Um, uh, 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 it's not their minds go. It's not good to have that they all their lives in their old age that the judges are all these old men. When when their education is such that even the legislature himself lacks trust in them as not being good men, it is not safe. In other words, the problem is that even the legislator himself lacks trust in them as not being good men. This is not safe. If their education is such that even the legislature doesn't trust them, therefore it has to keep checks on them. That this is not safe to have that situation be. For the Senate in that sense. It is evident that those who have share in this office has been thoroughly affected by bribery and favorism in handling many common matters. Hence, it is better that they not go unaudited. They need to be audited. It's so easy that they are bribery and favoritism because of they're not being really good men. So the Senate is supposed to be composed of men, but they're not really good men. Their education is not really good. The education is flawed, and they're not going to be really good men. But they're not ordered. But they better be ordered. But they're not. It is better that they not go unaudited. And now they do. So therefore, the Senate is not audited, and therefore that leads to what? Favoritism and bribery. Maybe they should be audited in that sense. Again, this is that famous line. I know this audit, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve Board. These men, not we want to audit them. If anything that has the power like this needs to be audited and checked. Aristotle seems to be saying here. If it doesn't have audits, and particularly if they're not going to be if they're truly virtuous, then you maybe not auditing them. But they're not really that, and because they're not, you can't ensure that, and you should have audited them, but it's not done. So oops. Now they hence it would be now they do not audit them, right? The office of the overseer, in other words, back to the overseer now, might be held to be the proper one to admit all the offices, but this is too great a gift to the overseers, and it is not in this way that we say the auditing ought to be carried out. So maybe we should have to audit it, but this is not how auditing should be done. Okay, this is why he says the office of overseer might be held to be the proper auditor, but it's too great gift to the overseer. The overseer will use it as a weapon against even the aristocracy. So therefore, this is not a good way of auditing carried out, right? In that sense. Further, the election they hold of senators is childish in the matter of decision, and to have one who claims to merit the office ask it for himself is not correct. For one who merits the office should rule whether he wishes or not. So you have to wish you want it. You have to want it. You have to ask for it. In other words, no. You should. The person who should be not. You should. If we should, other people should make you do it, even if you want to or don't want to. Let's go to decision 89. The senators were chosen by popular assembly by an archaic process of acclamation. In other words, I had to do this, and they was, oh, yeah. So I push myself up, and then the people, in other words, archaic processes of the people saying, yeah, him. Well, how are you going to get the people to say, yeah? Favoritism, things like that, bribery. Okay, that's again. For one who lacks to office should rule whether he wishes or not. Okay, now, but as it is, legislature is evidently doing what he has done with respect to in other words, the legislator, the lawmaker, is evidently doing what he has done with respect to the rest of the regime. In other words, he is evidently doing what he has done with respect to the rest of the regime. It is with a view of making the citizens ambitious that he used this device in the elections of senators. He wants ambitious. He wants aggression. He wants to make them want more. But it also leads to why they're aggression and greedy. For the election of senators, for no one would ask for office unless he were ambitious. And yet most voluntary acts of injustice among human beings arise from ambition or greed. So that's what injustice. In other words, Aristotle here is in other words, literally love of honor, philotimia, and the love of money, philioclimetia, the two things. In other words, the love of honor, philometia, and love of money are the real reasons. This is the two: love of honor and the love of greed. Is literally what it means. That voluntary acts of injustice among human beings result from the love of excessive love of honor and the love of money. Very done. Now 29. We're pretty long. I'm sorry. I want to finish this. Concerning kingship and whether it is better for it to exist in cities or not, this will be discussed later. I'm not going to discuss kingship. He's going to discuss this at the end of book 3, the last 4 chapters of book 3. Okay, he's not going to discuss this now. This is, again, 91, 3, 13 through 14. This is the discussion of absolute kingship, the Pambasileia, which I wrote about in my book, Aristotle's Best Regime, which is about book 3. But it is surely better in any evident not to have it at present, as it is present, hereditary office, but to judge each king on the basis of his own manner of life. In other words, the judge, shouldn't be hereditary, but rather you should basically judge a king on their character, who they are, their life. Now it is clear that the legislator did not himself suppose it possible to make them gentlemen. In other words, he didn't think it was possible to make them gentlemen. At any rate, he lacks trust in them as not being sufficiently good men. In other words, he doesn't trust the king to being good men. And on this account, that they repeatedly sent them as on embassies accompanied by their enemies, and hold that factional conflict between kings meant preservation for the city. Now, this is very interesting. Sparta had a system of dual kingship, each king being drawn from a separate hereditary line. Factional conflict between kings and their partisans was thus a natural development. Kings were regularly accompanied by overseers when on military position, but kings did not, as a rule, undertake diplomatic message. Aristotle perhaps here has the mind the Andros matter. See in chapter 84 about the Persian. That example he didn't pay. That note 84. So okay, so therefore this is not the kings would lead to conflict. The kings. This is like the same thing with what happened in not kings, but what the Romans did with the king power when they divided it into two consuls, checking each other, right? Therefore, there was in order to stop the king, you couldn't trust the king, so you had to have two kings. The one, this is that Madisonian interest checking interest, right? This is that kind of trying to solve the problem through a mechanism. Aristotle's no, it's better to have a good person. That you couldn't choose a good person, so therefore you divided it, and therefore you had two corrupt people creating factional conflict. Okay, and this is wouldn't this also be Aristotle's critique of Madison's Federals 10? That the interest checking interest creates endless factional conflict. Okay, and that's why there is a tendency those who think we should avoid all factional conflict looks at interest. They look at interest groups as an enemy of good government, right? So therefore, if you have a naive understanding of politics as good government, you look at interest groups and the way interest groups check each other. Oh, this is bad. Well, but this is the mechanism. Once you accept greed, and greed being the reality of life, you need the check of those things on here. Aristotle says, that's okay, that's institutional, but that's not enough. You need character. You need good things like good character and education of things. Otherwise, it's not going to hold together. Now he turns to the next point. The legislation concerning common messes, or so-called friends messes, 93, the pidita, the etymology of this term is uncertain, but may derive from a dialect of the word friend, philos, right? So that the friend messes, right? The was not finally handled by the one who first established them. The support of this should have come primarily from the treasury. 94. This is literally from the common things, the koinonia. This should have come from the koinonia, the common thing, treasury, as in Crete. But among the Spartans, everyone must contribute, even though some of them are very poor and unable to afford the expense. Hence, the result is the opposite of what the legislation intends. Because, in other words, if you're going to have common messes, they should come from common funds. As the Cretans do, he says. But the Spartans don't do that. Everyone has to contribute. Everyone from their private things must contribute, but then some can't, right? And therefore, this does the opposite of it. Instead of bringing people together, it reinforces their separateness, right? The commonness has become exclusive to those who don't do it, right? In other words, hence it results opposite. For he wants the institution of common messes to be democratic one, but it is the least of all democratic as a result of the legislation being handled in this way. For it is not easy for the very poor to take part in it, and yet this is the traditional defining principle of the regime among them, that whomever is unable to contribute this fee does not take advantage as part of the regime. So remember, you need, in order to take part of the regime, you need to do this. So this suggests that a certain number of Spartan citizens were excluded from full political rights on their failure to support the expenses of common messes. This may be the class of inferiors, the Hippomenes referred by Xenophon in Hellenica, right, which figures in the conspiracy of Calderon in the early 4th century. So in other words, this is what happens. Aristotle is saying the idea that you, in order to become a full participant in the regime, you needed to give your money to the common masses. But if you couldn't do that, you couldn't come to common, you couldn't afford to do that. Therefore, you didn't partake in the common masses. You didn't partake in the common masses. You didn't fully participate in the regime. Okay, and therefore it destroys what was meant to be democratic egalitarian ended up not. It ended up causing a division between. It increased the oligarchic character of the regime as a contest like this. Um, uh, 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 in other words, now 33. The law concerning admirals have been criticized by others, and correctly so. This is the cause of factional conflict. And the position of the admiral had been established almost as another general against that of the kings, who are generals in perpetuity. The kings are general now. Again, 96. The original occupied was originally occupied periodically by the kings themselves. The office of admirals, because archons or strategoi, the strategoi, right? The kings were strategoi. The Naokos, the rulers of the sea, had come under the control of the overseers by the 8th century. Though subject to renewal every year, the office accomplished greater power, particularly in the field of foreign policy, right? During the tenure of Lysander, late after the development of Lysander, right? The idea that once Sparta became naval power, and that navy power of the admirals became more powerful, and therefore increased the power of this in that sense. And those criticized that were right about this. This is a problem, and they should have been more control over that, the admirals. Moreover, one may criticize the basic premise of the legislature in the way Plato criticizes it in the laws. Again, this is 97. This is where he does it. Laws makes a reference to that. Laws 97. Law 97. The entire organization of the laws is with a view to a part of virtue, warlike virtue. For this is useful with the view of domination. In other words, what's wrong with it is that it's only part of virtue, and the virtue that is dealing with war, and this is only useful for not peace but for dominating others. Yet, while they preserved themselves as long as they were at war, they came to ruin when they were ruling an empire, though not knowing how to be at leisure. And because there is no training among them that has more authority or is ruling than the training of war. So there's no training other than the training of war. There's no training of administration. There's no training of leisure. And because of this, they don't know how to be at leisure. They only know how to be at war. And therefore, they're at peace. They're running an empire. They can't be always at war. You have to maintain. You have leisure, and they have to know how to use leisure well. The Spartan does not know how to use leisure well. This era is no slight one. They consider that the good things men generally fight over are won by virtue rather than vice, and beautifully so, nobly so, right? But they can conceive these things to be better than virtue, which is not kalos, beautiful, fine, or noble. So in other words, the things that they do should be won by virtue, but they rate these things more than in other words, they think it's better than virtue. Okay, that's why they're greedy. That's why this leads to ambition. This just leads to things. Also poorly handled among the Spartites is the matter of common funds. So the Spartites, the people like how to handle the common funds. For there is nothing in the treasury of the city, in spite of their being compelled to carry on great wars, and they are very backwards in paying special war taxes. The Spartites themselves, about common funds and things like this. They are very backwards in paying their special war taxes. But because most of the land belongs to the Spartites, they do not scrutinize each other's payments and such taxes. The consequence for the legislature has been the opposite of advantageous. He has created a city lacking funds and individuals greedy for them. So therefore, the Spartites own most of the land. But because they're powerful, the Spartites are numerous and they're powerful. They don't want to be, but because they most of the land, they don't want to scrutinize each other payments. They don't pay enough. This is what they say. The wealthy, sometimes the wealthy are the people who don't pay their taxes and don't contribute the most. They don't, they don't scrutinize it. If they're not being scrutinized, not being checked, if there are eyes on them and they're scrutinized, then they'll obey. They'll fear of being exposed will force them to do their duty. But if they're not being exposed, watched, and looked at, I got better things to do with this money than that, than the city, and I'll be late with that payment. Concerning the regime of the Spartans, then let this much be said. For these things, as one, for these are the things one might particularly criticize. So notice, not a kind word about Sparta. Not a kind. This is supposed to be one of the city, and it's the first one he deals with. The first city that everyone holds that this is a finely administered. Aristotle, not a kind word, except maybe that the idea that the blending of the regime might be good in that idea, but it's badly executed. In other words, not really a kind word for the city. And this is what all the things he criticizes. Okay, we end here. It's been a long one. This is a very long one. I apologize if you think it's been too long, but I wanted to get this thing done at one time. If you have any comments or criticisms or questions, put them down there, and if I see them, I'll respond. Like it, dislike it. We could dislike it because it's too long. Some friend of mine said, "You're just too long. You should break them up." I said, "But I don't want. I want to keep." The idea is a chapter, a theme at a time. I like to do this, and that works pretty well. But I hope it does. Um, please subscribe if you're not subscribed. Encourage a friend to subscribe. Share on social media. You can follow me on social media below if you're interested, and you can do that. You can be a contributor to help through Patreon and other things, subscriber star, if you want to help the channel to grow and to do more things, and also help me, do things. Or you can just go if you want to help contribute to me. You can do so directly through buying my book at Lulu, which is Aristotle's a notebook on Aristotle's politics. It's not a commentary; it's a workbook. It's basically Cliff Notes on politics, Aristotle's politics. It's a study guide. It's not lieu of reading this politics. It's a book designed to help you as you read the politics. That's why it's going to be useful to buy for our time here together. Okay, I've done this many times. I'll stop. Have a good day. Take care. Bye bye.